Hi everybody, welcome back. In the last video, we introduced public goods and common resources, and we looked at how we classify goods as either excludable or non-excludable, and rival and non-rival. And so really quickly, public goods are non-excludable and non-rival. So I can't be excluded from having it, and by me having it, that doesn't take away from other people's ability to have it, like in a national park, for example. And then common resources, also non-excludable, but rival. So if I have some of it, it takes away the other people's ability to have it. So like fish in international waters. Okay, so we're going to go through each of these. We're going to start with public goods. And the problem with public goods is that it's hard to let the free market allocate them due to the free rider problem. I assume maybe most people are familiar with this concept, but just to define it, a free rider is a person who receives the benefit of a good but avoids paying for it. A person who receives the benefit of a good but avoids paying for it. Okay, and because public goods are non-excludable, if a good is non-excludable, people have the incentive to be free riders because there's no way to prevent non-payers from using it. And the result of that is that the good is not produced, even if buyers, this is kind of the extreme result, is that in a case where you have public goods without any sort of policy intervention, is that firms are not going to have an incentive to go into that business. Why am I going to start building nice trails for everybody to use, which is going to cost me money to build if there's no way to be compensated for doing that? And so that's why, trail systems are another good example of a public good. It's hard to privately allocate trail systems because you have a free rider problem and people can use a trail without paying for it. All right. And so ultimately, coming back to the externality and the role of government, is that if the benefit exceeds the cost, then the government should provide that good and tax the people who benefit. Okay. The problem with doing that, as you can imagine, is that measuring the benefit of a good without prices on it is a very hard thing to do. Good thing for economists because it gives us work, but it's a hard thing to do. And so what people will do are cost-benefit analyses. I don't even know why. Okay, a cost-benefit analysis is a study that compares the costs and the benefits of providing a public good. Okay. And yeah, so that's pretty straightforward, but this is done all the time in order to try to figure out because the market isn't doing a good job at figuring out the value of the public good. We use a cost-benefit analysis to try to figure out how much do we value a public good. And then based on the cost of providing that, then you can figure out whether or not to do it, and then how much to tax people. So public good subject to the free rider problem. Again, we talked about a couple examples before, but important public goods, which are funded often through taxes, national defense, knowledge created through basic research, and poverty fighting programs. So all of these things also, like, education, people benefit, and so instead of the private market allocating these goods, the government steps in, taxes the people who benefit, and allows it to be provided. Okay. Next, common resources. So similar to public goods, because they are not excludable, is that you can't prevent free riders from using them. You have the same problem then, that there's little incentive for firms to provide them, and then the role of government is see that they're provided, again, often also through taxes. The other problem with common resources, though, is that they are rival in consumption. So if I use it, it reduces the abilities, reduces the other's ability to use it, and so there's an additional role of government for common resources, not only to see that they're provided, but also to ensure that they're not overused. For example, like overfishing in the ocean. And so with public goods, we have the free rider problem. We have the same problem in common resources, but we also have a second problem, which we can talk about as the tragedy of the commons. And we're going to do this through this, parable or story, which is going to illustrate why common resources get used more than is socially desirable. That's back to this idea of overconsumption. Okay, so we're going to do this little thought experiment here. We have a medieval town, some sheep graze on common land, and as the population grows, the number of sheep grow. The land is fixed, so that's kind of an important part, and the grass is going to begin to disappear with overgrazing. All right, the private incentives. So in this town with the public kind of common land, me as a single individual, my incentive is, okay, I've got some sheep. I just want to let my sheep keep grazing there and having their babies to have, so that I can have more sheep, which will make me better off. So my private incentive is to keep using the land, keep grazing my sheep on that common land. And that's going to outweigh the social cost of using that land carefully. And what's going to happen is the grass disappears from overgrazing more and more and more with these private incentives, and it will get to the point where if there are so many sheep there, it's going to throw the ecosystem out of whack, that there's not enough grass, sheep start dying, and in the end, the grass can't even grow. People can't raise sheep, there's no grass for them. And now, because of the individual private incentives, now nobody can raise any sheep. And so that's also due to an externality. Allowing one's flock. So the externality, remember, is my private interactions affecting a third party unrelated. So if I allow my single flock to graze on the common land, it reduces the ability for a third party, in this case other families, to raise their sheep. And so that, if we don't allow for that social cost, that extra social cost, it's going to result in the overuse of the land, overgrazing, and then the grass disappears. Now nobody can raise any sheep. Okay, so how do we fix it? So there are a few options. We talked about externalities last time in the last series of videos. So we could regulate the resource. We could say, okay, every family you get 2 sheep per year, right? Any more sheep you have than that, you have to slaughter and just get rid of somehow. So that's one option. You could impose a corrective tax, like we talked about, so that people internalize the externality. And so you could have, a per sheep tax. Or the way that we see this in the real world is that there are hunting and fishing licenses. If you hunt and fish more, you pay more tax. Makes some sense, all right? As we talked about in the last video, national parks, technically, they're a public good or a common resource, but when they're congested, we have entrance fees. And being congested is what makes it a common resource. So you have entrance fees. So the people who go to the park more, they pay more, which makes some sense, right? And so this is actually quite a good solution. As we talked about in the last series of videos, corrective taxes are usually a much better policy solution than a kind of command and control across the board regulatory use. Because if you say, okay, everybody can only hunt, if we're talking about hunting and fishing, everyone can only harvest one deer per year, the whole population. That's it, one per year. Well, some people, they don't care about hunting. They don't want to hunt. They're not going to hunt anyway. Some people like hunting a lot, and they're going to want to go and harvest 4 deer, right? So if you regulate the resource, you're going to tell some people who don't care about hunting that they can harvest a deer. You're going to tell some people who want to harvest 4, they can only harvest 1. And so in this case, people, the policy is not in line with people's values. Hunting and fishing licenses, well, if people really like hunting, they can pay more for an extra license or an extra tag, right? And so corrective taxes are generally much better than a kind of imposing regulation. And then third, we talked about cap and trade, pollution permits. Theoretically, you could figure out, okay, coming back to this sheep example, you have some amount of land, and if this is the amount of land you have, and that can only support 100 sheep, if you start to get above 100 sheep, you're going to run into the overgrazing, overuse, and it's going to destroy the land. Well, if 100 is the socially optimal level, you release 100 pollution permits to the population, either randomly or by auction, or actually that initial distribution of the permits is kind of the hard part. But once there are 100 permits there, the people who really benefit from raising and grazing their sheep, they're going to buy more of those permits. The people who don't need their permits, they're going to sell them off to the people who need them. So a cap and trade system, like a corrective tax, is pretty well in line with setting the expectations similar to the value of the individuals involved. So that's another, and that's again what we see cap and trade with pollution and other types of emissions. We also see that for radio waves. So remember, if you want to have radio signals out there, that's non-excludable. Anybody could pick up that radio wave, and then rival in consumption. If I have the radio signal, nobody else can have that signal. So this too is kind of a permit type system, and that gets auctioned off. And then the third option is kind of the private market option. Is you come up here, you divide this into parcels, and okay, now if I own this plot of land, and that's my land, well, I'm going to make sure that I don't overgraze that land so that it becomes totally useless. If I have a private plot of land, it's going to be in my interest to make sure that it's sustainable and it moves on indefinitely. But if anybody can use this entire plot of land and it's a common resource, I'll just put as many sheep as I want because it's in my private interest to use as much of this as possible. And I don't think as much about the overuse or the social costs because it's a public plot of land. But if this is my plot of land, I'm not going to overgraze it. Otherwise, I'm going to lose my ability to raise sheep. So you could subplot it out into private parcels. You could tax like a per sheep tax. So I'm only going to raise sheep if it's valuable to me. I could do a cap and trade system. A lot of different options. But these latter three are generally better than some across the board type of regulation. Talked about that in the last series of videos as well. Okay, and so a few important common resources. Underground water, oil and gas. If I extract some oil from the ground, I can't be prevented from extracting oil from the ground without, if there were no regulations in place, then I could just take oil out of the ground. And if I take oil out of the ground, it's rival in consumption. That means nobody else can take that same oil out of the ground. So it is a common resource. Clean air and water. These are common resources. And then fish, whales, and other wildlife. So these are also common resources. The hunting example was a good one for talking about wildlife. But fish, especially in international waters, it's actually quite a problem. And whales, back in the day when people used whales for oil and all sorts of different things, a lot of fish and whales and other like sea creatures either already have gone extinct or have become endangered because of this problem of common resources. And unlike, say, like a national park or water within the country, so in the United States, you can put in some federal regulation. But if we're talking about international waters here, it gets very complicated and very hard to regulate and prevent this tragedy of the commons situation. So that's why we really do see a lot of the international fish stocks declining and becoming endangered or in some cases extinct. So this is a very hard issue to tackle because you're having to deal with policy on an international level. Okay, so anyway, those are some important ones there, and that's going to wrap it up. Quick chapter here. Public goods and common resources. The important parts to remember are, these, I left not enough space here, but, where's my mouse? Okay. So these should have been on new lines, but the problems that we run into with these public goods and common resources, so nobody owns the air, so we can't charge polluters. The result of that, too much pollution. And you can't benefit people you can't charge people who benefit from public goods. So national defense or national defense, but also things like public education, so on and so forth. the result, if you can't charge people, then we have too little education or defense, right? And so if you can't charge people, no one can charge polluters, too much pollution. Nobody can charge those who benefit. There's going to be an under provision of public goods. Yeah, this one is the good part. An under provision of public goods and overconsumption of common resources. So that kind of gets at the heart of what this chapter is all about. And so how do we fix it? We solve it with some different policy responses. The same policies as with externalities. Because common goods and public resources, common public goods and common resources create externalities. All right. So this is gonna leave it off here. And yeah, in the next video, we'll have going on to the next topic. I might create another short video on some more examples and policies and practices related to these public goods and common resources. Because otherwise, so far it's been a pretty short chapter. But we'll go ahead and start here. But keep an eye out, and I'll get another video posted up soon. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.